In this video, you'll learn how to set up an HTTP endpoint for deleting a resource. We will eventually need two, one for deleting users and one for deleting tasks. We'll focus on deleting users together, and deleting tasks will be your challenge. So far, we have 4 different routes for working with our users. Down below, right after the 4th one, we're going to add another express method call. Right here, express provides us with a delete method, allowing us to set up an HTTP endpoint that uses the delete HTTP method. So far, we've used post to create, get to read, we've used patch to update, and here we use delete to delete. Now, the URL for deleting is going to require their ID, similar to what we did for reading an individual user or updating one, so /users/:ID, and this is all the input we need. There isn't going to be anything on the request body that we need, just having the ID is enough to delete the user. Right here, we'll set up our async function with our 2 parameters. We have the request and the response objects, both of which we'll be using down below. Now, actually, deleting a resource isn't too bad. Typically, the less input we're taking in, the less complexity we have for a given route handler. In this case, the only thing we're accepting is the ID, so there's not a lot of work to do. I will be kicking things off, though, with a try-catch block. Let's go ahead and start there. Once we have this in place, we can focus on actually attempting to delete the user. Now, as we saw in the Mongoose documentation, there are a few different ways we can get that done. I'll head back over to Google Chrome. Right here, we have delete many, we have delete one. I also have find by ID and delete, and find one and delete. We're going to go ahead and use find by ID and delete right over here inside of index.js. Let's go ahead and knock that out. We are going to create a const for user. This is going to store the user that we end up deleting, if any, and we're going to await the promise that comes back from user.find by ID and delete. Perfect. Now, once we have that method call in place, the only thing we need to provide is the first argument, the ID of the user to remove, request.params.id, and we're done. Now down below, let's go ahead and see if there was actually a user to delete. If there was no user, we'll go ahead and send a 404 back right here. Return response.status 404. Then we'll go ahead and use send to send that back. Next up, if there was a user that got deleted, we'll stick with the default 200 status code and we'll just send the user data back. So response.send user. If someone's deleting a user, we want to send the deleted user as the response body. Next up, if something went wrong, we'll go ahead and send back a 500 response.status 500 using send to send that back. And this is honestly it. Now that we have this in place, we can go ahead and test things out, actually deleting users by their ID. I'm going to head over to Postman to get this done. Now, as always, we will need to set up a new request in Task App, so I'll start there. I'll call this one delete user, and once we have it in place, we're going to go ahead and grab the ID of a user to remove. Now I have that read users request we've worked with before. Here I have 3. I'll go ahead and delete this second one with the name Andrew. So I'll copy that ID to the clipboard, head over to the delete user request and start to manipulate it. The first thing I'll do is change the method from get over to delete, and then from there, we'll set the URL. That's going to be localhost on port 3000 /users/ the user ID. Now, there's no additional information required. We don't need any parameters, any headers, or any body data. This is enough to get things to work. I'm going to go ahead and save the request and fire it off. Now, when I do, what do I get? I get my 200 status code, which is fantastic. And down below, I can see the information for the user I'm deleting. And this is the exact one I saw just a few moments ago with the name of Andrew. The other users had either Andrew Mead or Jess in my case. Now, we fired this off once and it worked. If I fire it off again, it should fail because there's no longer a user with this ID. So I'll take the exact same request, I'll click send one more time, and right here we're getting a 404, which is correct. It should not have found a user with this ID since it was removed with the previous request we had made. So there we go. You now know how to delete users by their ID, and now it's going to be your challenge to do the same thing for tasks down below. We have our 4 endpoints for working with tasks, and we need a 5th one. That's going to go right here. Let's go ahead and start with the challenge comments. Right here, your goal is to allow for the removal of tasks. So you want to set up the endpoint handler, then attempt to delete the task by its ID. And once again, we have those 3 potential outcomes: success, task not found, or error. And we want to send a response back for all of those. Last up, test your work. So create the new request in Postman and attempt a few different requests to make sure everything is working as expected. All right, pause the video, knock that out, and when you're done, come back and click play. How'd that go? Let's go ahead and kick things off by setting up the endpoint handler right here. I'll be using app.delete once again. Now, in this case, we're trying to delete a task by its ID, so /tasks/ID, /:ID. Then we'll set up the callback function. It's an async function with request and response, and we'll set up our try-catch block to make sure that everything works as expected. Now, once we have that block in place, the first thing we want to do is attempt to delete the task by its ID. So right here, I will create a task variable where we'll store the deleted task, if any, and I will await a call to task.findById and delete like we used before. And in this case, request.params.id contains the ID of the task we're trying to remove. Now let's go ahead and set up the 3 different ways we'll end up responding. We have the 404 response if there was no task to delete. Right here, response.status 404, then .send, sending back nothing. Down below that, if things went well, we'll actually have the task to send back, response.send task. Last up, if an error did occur, we'll send back that 500, response.status, setting it equal to 500, and then using send to send things back to the requester. Now that we have this in place, we're all done, and we can actually test things out to make sure it's working as expected. I'm going to go ahead and remove the challenge comments, save the file for the final time in this one, and add a new request to the task app collection. Right here, add request. I'll call this one delete task, and once we have the name in place, we're going to go through the process of setting it up. If I click on it, we have to switch the actual HTTP method over to delete, then we can focus on setting up that URL. Right here, for me, that's going to be localhost:/tasks/some task ID. Now, if you don't have one, which I don't, we can always use the read tasks operation to get back an ID of all of the tasks we have access to. I'll go ahead and fire that off. Right here, I have 2. I'll go ahead and delete this one, learn the Mongoose library. I'll head back over to the delete operation and paste that in the URL field. Now, once again, there's no need to provide any additional information. I'm going to go ahead and save this one, send it off, and right here, I can see I got a 200 and I have the deleted task showing up. If I fire it off again, I would expect a 404, and that is exactly what I'm getting. So there we go. We now have endpoints for managing the 4 CRUD operations for our resources. We can create them, read them, update them, and delete them, allowing someone using this API to manage the data as they would need to. That's where we're going to stop for this video. There is just one video left for this section where you're going to learn how to refactor your application so you don't have every single route defined in the same file. I'm excited to get to that. Let's jump right in.